I did not come to Panther Creek looking for a miracle or a monster. I came with the ordinary loner's kit of survival and second chances spare batteries, a notebook labeled Letter of Truth, a camera that has seen more cracked sidewalks and diner booths than sunrises, and the sort of practiced, urban loneliness that can follow you from penthouse empties, lit by cold streetlights, all the way to a river mouth that remembers what people try to forget. So when the first pale light slid between the sycamores and I stepped down the damp bank, I told myself this would be another quiet reconnaissance, a responsible pass at a rumor, a long walk where trust is earned by not touching anything you do not understand, except that the water refused to keep my pace and the rumor refused to stay. Rumor because under the span of exposed roots, something small lifted and sank as if breathing, and in that heartbeat my chest turned into a locked room, and the key was somewhere under the surface, and every old wound I thought I had healed with busyness and distance and the anonymity of cities whispered that whatever this was, it was going to look like abandonment and redemption at the same time. I had heard the story the way the internet tells all stories now, meaning as a dare with coordinates blurred and outrage sharpened, with the kind of algorithmic cadence that feeds on our bruised pasts and our private appetite for confession, which is why I drove through the night instead of sleeping under the hum of luxury cars idling below a tower where I sometimes edit and sometimes ache, because the title that would not leave my head they buried a feather doll in Panther Creek, dragged at me, the way certain phrases drag at anyone who has been left behind by a parent or a lover or a system, and when the path bent and the creek unveiled itself in a run of glassy shallows, I felt the old survival mood fasten its buckles across my ribs, the cautious city-honed attention that hears every twig and weighs every shadow as a question of trust. And I said aloud, though no one else stood in the cold, this is not about clicks. This is about recognition. This is about whether the Cherokee healer people mentioned in quiet comments exists, and whether a vow made by a clan or a family could be honored in a place that has been fed to virality like meat to a machine. I am not a superstition hunter, and I am not a thief of sacred things. I was a foster kid who learned to keep a bag packed, a body that learned emotional distance early, a woman who knows how to sit in a neon diner at 3 in the morning and watch a couple try to forgive each other without touching hands. So when I saw the small figure lodged where the water eddies, I did not rush the way I have rushed men and jobs and apartments. I let my eyes travel in slow reconnaissance from the knot of river stones to the band of something that looked like sinew or reed, to the pale fray of feathers that at first seemed like a rotting fin, and then, with the movement of the current, resolved into a wrapped shape the size of a child's forearm, and whatever skepticism the city built into me did not dissolve, but it did step back, because what I recognized in my sternum was not horror and not titillation, but a fierce quiet that I remember from clinics of a second chance, where social workers speak softly and people bruise slowly back into hope, a quiet that says someone put a story here very carefully, and your job is not to solve it by noon. The water at Panther Creek is not the clear, theatrical blue of resort brochures or the brown fear of flood footage. It is that honest in-between that remembers recent rains and ankles and laughter, and the way loneliness swims with you when you try to wash it off. And as I crouched, I could smell the wet iron of stones and the moss that tastes like childhood even if you never had picnics. And I could hear the 2 notes of an unseen bird and the far soft ring of a highway that exists in every American place like an invisible vein. And in that layered soundscape I felt the old ache of missed connections begin its murmuring because the thing under the roots did not feel like an object, but a person who had not been allowed a face. And I thought of the phrase faceless attraction that I once mocked in a workshop and now realized describes those moments when you are drawn toward a human story, not because it flatters you, but because it names a wound you carry without a name. I had promised myself before I left the city that I would keep my voice first person without making the world revolve around me, that I would say I and me when it was honest to do so, and we when it was careful, that I would not turn Cherokee into costume words or the healer into a lure for a thumbnail, that I would not treat resilience like a trophy or forgiveness like a shortcut. So I stood there with my palms on my knees and I did the unglamorous thing, which is to write down details, precisely the binding in 3 turns, not 2. The feather tips darkened by water, not pigment, the absence of trinkets, the placement not lodged by accident but nested by intent. And I spoke to the creek the way I have spoken to mirrors in sleepless city bathrooms when healing felt like a rumor. And I said, I see you. I am not here to prove you wrong. I am here to be told no if that is the right answer. And the water kept its muscular conversation with the bank, and the shape kept lifting like breath. I know the verbs people expect me to use, the explosive ones that spike watch time in the first 60 seconds, snatched, ripped, revealed, exposed. But the older I get, the more I distrust velocity masquerading as virtue. So I did not touch the doll or the river stones. I did not even shadow it with my hand. I took one step back and I allowed the geometry of the scene to own me. The triangle made by root and stone and water. The diagonal of the early sun angling through low fog. The faint, almost bruise of a rope-shaped shadow thrown by a branch that had learned to bend. And instead of the old instinct to caption everything, I let the instinct of unspoken connection do the talking, because there is an intimacy to silence when you choose it on purpose, the kind that makes emotional intimacy possible later when someone finally speaks and you do not flinch. People say the creek hides what we cannot hold, but watching that small figure breathe with the current, I felt the reversal click into place, the way a seatbelt locks when you test it. The creek is not hiding anything. It is witnessing a promise, and whether that promise is grief or protection or both is not my right to declare. So I reached into my jacket and I pulled out the folded page. I call my letter of truth, which is not for an audience and not for an elder and not for absolution. It is for the version of me that shuts down when abandonment taps its glass. And I wrote, you have spent years in emotional distance because distance looked like strength. You have walked under streetlights past penthouse empties and believed that high windows mean safety. You have sought survival in movement and work and in love that defies fairy tale tropes, because the fairy tales never included you. And here by the water you will remember that resilience is not sprinting away from pain, but standing inside it without drowning other people to keep your head up. The internet will ask me later why I did not film the moment I am about to describe from 3 angles. Why I did not zoom and pan and capture the sound for memeability. Why I did not capitalize on the first 60 seconds with a bold voiceover that promised a Cherokee healer and a clan and a revelation. And the answer that I will give them is the same answer I gave my body when my hand started to reach. Because trust is earned over time and not with proofs. Because healing requires restraint. Because a second chance is not a trick you pull out of a hat while standing on a cracked sidewalk pretending you are above heartbreak. Because forgiveness sometimes begins with not touching what is not yours. I wanted a sign and I got one. Although not the kind that makes you feel cinematic. A wind came down the corridor of the creek and moved the feathers in a way that was almost nothing and yet felt like recognition. And in that barely movement my own hidden pain did its brief public appearance in the theater of my pulse. And behind the ache rose the slow bond that builds when you choose not to turn human sorrow into commerce. A bond with a place that had never heard my name and did not need to. A bond with the people who may have placed her here for reasons that do not require my comprehension. A bond with the healer whose name I had not yet learned, and whose counsel I would ask for if they permitted. a bond with the version of me that has resisted every clinic and every hand, because to be touched is to be seen, and to be seen is to risk being left again. I am not proud of how much I still crave spectacle when I am tired or lonely. But that morning I felt something like personal growth, not because I restrained a camera, but because I admitted aloud that I wanted to be chosen by a story, and not simply the one who chose it, and somewhere between that vulnerability and the trust I was trying to earn, somewhere between the emotional scars I carry and the quiet transformations I pray do not abandon me, somewhere between urban signage and river grammar, I understood that my first job was not to narrate this as a mystery solved, but to survive my own reflexes, so that a different kind of intimacy could happen later, one where forgiveness has nothing to do with permission and everything to do with responsibility. The first 60 seconds of any video want blood or revelation, and what this river gave me instead was a presence that did not need to be named, an almost voice the way tree limbs almost speak when they rub in wind. And I stood and I breathed and I said, I will leave her where she is, and I will ask before I speak, and I will not publish coordinates, and I will not turn Cherokee into a costume you can buy at the door of my channel. And my vow did not make the water warmer or the world kinder, but it did make my spine feel like it had choices. And in that new stance I heard the soft scrape of boot leather on the path behind me, and the lower register of a voice that carried neither threat nor apology, but the steadiness of someone who has learned that honor can be quiet. And the words slid across the water without raising a ripple as they said, "Do not take her from the creek." And my breath locked again for a different reason, because I knew from the way the air obeyed that I had stepped into a story I would not be allowed to own, which is, perhaps, the only kind worth telling. What I did not know, and what you will ask me next, is whether the voice belonged to the Cherokee healer people only whisper about, and whether the clan whose name I will never repeat had already marked me as a risk or a witness, and whether the secret I was trying to respect would let itself be shared without being harmed. And before I answer any of that, I will tell you the truest cliff I can leave you on, the one that kept me from sleeping that night and may keep you from skipping ahead, which is simply this. I turned slowly without touching the water or the doll or my camera, and I raised my empty hands because sometimes emotional intimacy begins with nothing in your grip. And the person at the edge of the path looked at me, not like a trespasser, and not like a customer, and not like a savior who would make their life easier with a video, but like someone who had been abandoned and had chosen not to abandon anyone else. And before I could ask a single question, they asked me one that cut through every defense I had built in the city, which was, do you want the secret, or do you want to help guard her? He did not confirm a title, or perform a role or pose for my narrative. He checked whether my phone was recording and whether my metadata had been bleeding location through the seams, and when he saw I had arrived with more restraint than hunger, he nodded with the calm of a person who has had to raise boundaries like houses after storms, and he spoke a sentence the internet rarely remembers. You can tell a story if the story can still live after you leave, which is how I learned the shape of the deal, not as access but as duty, not as lore but as ethics, and once I heard the tone, I could hear my own habits starting to crack, the way emotional distance pretends to be maturity, the way survival mood pretends to be wisdom, the way bruised pasts write scripts that make every creek a confessional and every confession a commodity. He set the terms on the air like tools set on cloth, clean and specific, no faces without consent, no coordinates disguised as beauty, no sacred names tossed to captions, no speculation edited to sound like knowledge, no staged retrievals that injure the very thing we claim to protect. And while he outlined, I felt an unfamiliar relief because rules that guard tenderness are not cages. They are bridges. and for the first time in years I could imagine filming from a posture other than fear, which is what loneliness had made of me in every neon diner at midnight, in every foster home where you learn to leave quietly, in every penthouse empty where you mistake a skyline for recognition. He asked me to repeat exactly what I had noticed 3 turns in the binding. Feathers water dark, not paint dark. River stones like a crib, placement intentional, no trinkets. And he listened the way people listen when they are charting your capacity rather than testing your performance. And when I finished, he said the sentence I wish was printed above every comment section that discovers a grave thing and decides it must be a threat. Grief needs vessels. And I realized how fast my industry makes curses out of promises, and how quickly an audience conditioned by spectacle confuses breath for danger, and how simply a community can be misread when you refuse to believe that tenderness and strength share a body. He did not call himself a Cherokee healer, and he did not summon a clan as spectacle because these words are not angles for me to shoot. They are responsibilities carried by people who do not owe me their definitions, so I adjusted the lens inside my chest rather than the one on my camera, and I said aloud, "The only thing that matters when you are allowed to stand close to a story you do not own. I can keep silence where silence is care, and I can speak where speaking protects, and I can live with the fact that they buried a feather doll in Panther Creek is not a headline to solve but a boundary to honor." And he watched me long enough to feel whether I meant it. Then he offered the part that would test me more than any reveal could, a difference that turns creators into guardians. A secret is not information, it is duty. He told me I could leave with a clear conscience and tell my audience we do not dox grief, and we do not monetize mourning, and we do not confuse resilience with access. Or I could walk away from the creek right now and learn what I am allowed to learn in a place where the ground is older than rumors and the wind says more than I will. And if I chose the second path, I would accept that trust is earned over time and not purchased with views. And I would accept that redemption in my life might look like refusing to publish what would make me trend. And I would accept that forgiveness sometimes means telling less and standing longer. And I said the line that made me feel both terrified and lighter than I have felt in years. I want to help guard her more than I want to solve her. We left the water without touching it, and as we climbed the bank, a car door opened on the shoulder where the asphalt frays, and someone called a name I will not repeat because coordinates come in many forms and one of them is the syllable you overheard. And I tasted the old panic that always asks for proof. Show me the healer on camera. Show me the doll lifted for the frame. Show me the vow written in subtitles. And I let the panic burn through like a fever because I was learning a different intimacy, the kind that begins when someone asks you to choose duty over adrenaline. And I kept my phone dark because the cliffhanger I needed was not a shot. It was a promise. That if I returned to Panther Creek, it would be with consent and with care and with a willingness to be useful in the smallest, least cinematic ways. He glanced back at the water once, the way you look at a relative sleeping, and he gave me one more line to hold between my teeth so I wouldn't talk when I got scared. We do not reveal to be admired. We reveal enough to recruit help, and if you are here for help, you will learn what you need. And if you are here for heat, you will learn to walk away. And I heard in that distinction all the years I have used work to avoid being known, all the times love offered me a slow bond, and I ran toward faceless attraction because faces make promises you can break. And I thought, this is what healing looks like when no one claps. This is what a second chance sounds like when it does not try to be a show. At the ridge, the wind pulled at my jacket and the letter of truth rustled like a wing, and the car on the shoulder idled as if impatience could make a river surrender. And he asked me a question that I will ask you because a cliffhanger only works if it touches your chest where mine is beating, when the choice is proof or protection. Which one will you make when no one is watching? And if a family vows their clan will guard her, will you add your breath to that vow, or demand a better angle? And if a Cherokee elder says not here, will you hear no, or will you finally hear care? They say the creek swallows what we can't and carry, so what are we trying to drown? I asked aloud, not to bait a clip, but because even in the quiet I could hear the town's chorus hitching a ride on the current, the overlapping fragments of witchcraft and old stories and kids' prank traveling downstream like bottle caps, each rumor bright enough to catch a glance and cheap enough to be thrown away. And as I stood in the half-shade of Panther Creek, I understood why each one spreads the way oil spreads after a spill. Because fear wants an enemy it can point at, nostalgia wants an ending it can polish, and boredom wants a thrill it can own without consequence. While grief, which is the real engine of most hauntings, asks something harder from us: time, restraint, responsibility, and we would rather hashtag than hold. I mapped the rumors the way you map a river's eddies, not to sail into them but to know how to avoid their undertow, the witchcraft current curls where new money meets old dread, where luxury cars idle at trailheads while their drivers scroll for coordinates that will let them touch a sacred no without hearing it. The old stories drift gathers where people feel the ache of dislocation and want to borrow a cosmology without paying for its care. The kids' prank trickle runs in neighborhoods that don't want to imagine the seriousness of love, because if a feather-wrapped doll is only a stunt, then no one has to admit that tenderness has a shape and weight and place, and that someone in town chose to keep that promise in water rather than in the fickle heat of a house. It would be easier for my edit if I simply arranged these rumors like exhibits and burned them down with facts. But rivers do not respect the courts we build for them, and Panther Creek, for all its smallness, carries floods through backyards, carries July laughter from swim holes down to culverts, carries the sound of school let out and the names of families that have stayed and families that have scattered, and I will not dox that geography with a slow pan and an ominous score when its living map is already doing the work of witness. So I placed the creek where it belongs, in the story of people and seasons, not in the spectacle engine, and I placed myself inside that story with the humility my bruised past still resists, because the truth is that I am a storyteller on a balance beam strung between curiosity and harm, with survival mood buckled across my ribs like a safety harness that helps and hinders at once. And when the elder who asked me not to film his face, and whom I will call elder because that is the closest English has to responsibility embodied, asked me to list what I felt standing there the first time, I did not recite my research or my rights. I said fear, and grief, and respect. And then I added jealousy in a voice so low it startled me. Jealousy for people who learned early that love can be trusted to stay. And he did not let me hang there. He said without judgment that fear can be an ally if it teaches you to move gently, that grief can become a boat if you stop trying to push it under, that respect is only real when it costs you something, and that jealousy can be a teacher if it names the intimacy you have been too careful to ask for. I could feel the old urban loneliness trying to reassert itself, the diner booths that hold you without touching, the cracked sidewalk where you perfect the art of not needing help, the penthouse empties where you watch streetlights paint your walls and call the glow a plan. But the creek and the elder kept me in the present tense, kept me from turning this into a metaphor I could swallow without chewing. That's closer than the rumors. I felt the defensive architecture I used to survive. Go quiet, long enough for responsibility to step forward, because it is one thing to drag a story into light, and quite another to stand between it and the flood. I told him how the prove. Comments had already begun their soft violence. The ones who write, "I'm Cherokee," as a pass to consume anything labeled Cherokee without asking whether a living community had asked to be placed on their plate. the ones who confuse representation with extraction, and he did not ask me to defend my audience or my income or my industry. He asked me to consider whether the story I was making had built people into guardians or gawkers, and whether my craft could hold a boundary the way the creek holds a floating leaf at the edge of a swirl until it's time to release it. And I said I do not know, which is not a posture the internet rewards, and he said that not knowing is honest as long as you do not use it to excuse harm. We walked a short way upriver, no cameras, no notes, only the world in its ordinary arrangement. Kids' laughter far off where the water is shallow, a dog shaking itself dry in an explosion of brightness. A flood line marked on a cottonwood like a ruler in a grandmother's kitchen, and the scrape of gravel wheel noise from the county road. And he showed me, without turning the moment into lesson theater, how families had left their signatures here in the unremarkable ways that reveal love. A tire swing scar on a limb, a fire ring buried by spring growth, a stretch of bank shored up with stones the year a grandmother died and no one wanted their grief to wash away. And as the map unfolded, I saw how easily a rumor can erase a place by turning it into a single image and a single feeling you can buy. My personal conflict did not evaporate. It clarified into a question I could carry without twisting it into content, which is whether I am willing to be trusted with a story that does not perform on my schedule. And before I could dress that question up with the language of brand and art, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and brought out a small bundle bound with a thin thread. And even before he spoke, I felt my body change its breathing, the way you do when someone sets a newborn inside a room, not because I thought he would perform a ceremony for my benefit, but because the tone of the air said these are not props, these are reminders. And when he said, "Let's start with breath," the creek seemed to reflect the phrase back across itself like a vow passed hand to hand in the dim of a vigil. He did not hand me the bundle like a prize. He held it in his palm like the kind of tool you do not use unless you are prepared to repair what you break. And he looked at the water the way a person looks at a grave they tend and a child they love in the same morning. And I thought of how many times I have spread rumors in my own way about myself, about what I deserved, about what intimacy would always cost, and I understood that the only way this next part could be told was if I let breath, not rumor, set the pace, which is the opposite of what every platform teaches, and exactly why this creek had not spat me out yet. "Let's start with breath," he repeated, and the words did not promise magic so much as attention, the kind that turns a room into a place where harm is less likely. And though I wanted to ask him what the bundle was and what he would reveal, and whether the clan who will guard her had chosen a plan, I kept my tongue still because he had already told me the only sequence that would keep this from becoming another story people devour and forget. Breath before questions, responsibility before reach, river before rumor. And if you are standing with me here, letting the impatient part of your pulse quiet enough to recognize the shape of a different kind of suspense, then you already know why the cliff at the edge of this chapter is not a gotcha but a door. He rotated the bundle once in his hand, so the feather tips faced the light, and he said again, softer, "Let's start with breath." And the chapter that follows will be about feathers and meaning, not as spectacle, not as pan-tribal aesthetics, but as the specific grammar of a family's choice to remember someone gently in water that remembers back. He told me feathers remember breath, not tricks. And in the way he said it, I heard a border being drawn between performance and practice, the boundary that keeps a teaching from collapsing into a prop. So before I tell you what he told me, I need to lay my own ground rules on the bank with his. This is a teaching frame, not a ceremony. This is about a specific family's decision, not about content creators raiding a whole people's meanings for mood boards. This is first person not because I need spotlight, but because accountability has to wear a name, and today that name is mine. We stood where the creek widens into a low, slow mirror, and he opened the bundle enough that I could see the feather tips without asking to hold them, because the first principle he kept repeating without saying it outright was that stewardship begins with distance and moves toward care only as trust permits. And in the small fan of those feathers, I could see something my city-raised loneliness had forgotten, that breath leaves marks we can honor without embalming them, and that the exhale of a person you loved can be given a place to rest without turning their absence into a museum, that the living need to remember the living without betraying the dead, which is why feathers, in this story, are not magic and not mischief. They are a memory you can touch without extracting it, a promise that does not need to be published to be kept. I have seen the internet flatten differences into native aesthetics or tribal spirituality, the way a tourist flattens a small town into a single diner and a single mural. And I have done my part in that flattening through ignorance and speed. So I will say again for the record and for your search bar, pan-tribal generalizations are not wisdom. They are shortcuts that insult living people. What follows is not the meaning of feathers everywhere. It is the meaning I was allowed to hear in this place, for this family, under conditions that ask me to prefer accuracy to reach and stewardship to possession, which means there are gaps in what I will tell you, and those gaps are not failures of storytelling. They are evidence that the story is still alive. He spoke about why a doll may be faceless or feathered in this context, not as a riddle but as a mercy, because faces ask for certainty while grief can rarely give more than breath and weight and a direction to lay your hands. And when a family chooses feather wrapping for remembrance, it is sometimes because a soft boundary is the kind that keeps people most tenderly. You can come close, and you can speak, and you can be held by the act of holding, but you do not impose a fixed likeness on a life that has already become light and water and wind. And in that understanding I felt my own need to fix things, loosen the old emotional distance that pretends to be respect but is actually fear beginning to melt. Because it turns out that love, which defies fairy tale tropes, looks less like heroic rescue and more like daily care, like returning to a creek on a Tuesday to notice the waterline and retie the band when spring floods it loose. I wanted to ask for the name the doll stands for, wanted to engrave the internet with a specific that would anchor attention to responsibility. But he had already shown me the difference between possession and stewardship. Possession says, tell me enough to make me feel like I own the story. Stewardship says, tell me enough to let me show up in the right way. And when I looked down at the water, I saw how easily my trade slides into the first, and how much work it will take to live in the second. And I told him out loud that I could feel the clickbait version of me drafting lines in my throat, and that I did not want to be its instrument anymore. And he nodded with a tenderness that made my chest sting, because for all our myths about stoicism, real strength often shows itself as attention, not as armor. He said the creek is not a hiding place, it's a witness, and the sentence landed with the clean weight of a tool you will reach for again and again because it fits your hand. A witness does not hoard and does not perform. A witness stays, and if the creek witnesses a promise, then your job, if you are allowed to be near it, is not to pass judgment on the form that promise takes, but to ask whether your presence helps the promise stand or pushes it toward collapse. And I understood why rumor does so much damage so quickly. It recruits people into performing certainty for each other until there is no room left for care. I thought about the difference between the urban mirrors that have taught me to inventory myself for flaws, and the river mirror that asked me to inventory my responsibilities. One reflects your edges and dares you to carve them sharper. The other widens until you remember you have a place in a living geography, and that your choices slosh into other lives. And standing there with feathers in the elder's palm, I felt the slow bond I have been too proud to accept begin to knit. The bond where trust is earned with consistency, where vulnerability is the absence of a stunt, where resilience stops being the story of how hard you can make your face, and starts being the story of how gently you can carry what is not yours. He showed me, without showing you, because some lines hold how a family tends what they placed, what they check after a storm, how they read the bank for trouble the way a nurse reads skin for pressure points, and he did it with sentences as plain as river stones. No mystery tone, no thunderclap, only the grammar of care. And from that grammar I learned that redemption in my world may look like refusing to extract even when invited. That healing in my body may sound like leaving the right silence intact. That forgiveness I owe the child I was may start with choosing stewardship over possession when the choice arrives dressed as a hashtag that could pay my rent. I asked him then the question that had been waiting under my tongue since I first saw the feathers breathe. A question I had polished to look humble, but which I now saw had the glitter of misdirection in it. Who buried her? As if naming they would relieve me of a burden and give me something clean to carry back to an audience that wants faces and culpability more than it wants context. And he looked at me with a patience that did not flatter and did not scold. And he said with the gentleness you use to stop a child from cutting their hand on a shiny shard, "You're asking the wrong question." He did not leave me humiliated on the bank. He lifted my gaze from the satisfying hunt for they toward the discipline of, who is she to those who love her? And who can you be if you are to be near her without harm? And who will you call into better behavior if you tell? This. And the shift was so simple and so total that I almost missed the ground moving under me. Because I have built a career on finding out. And here I was being asked to allow in, and the difference felt like someone removing a weight I had confused with a spine. If this were a different channel and I were a different person, this is where I would splice in night vision and a secret name and coordinates disguised as poetry. But I have already told you that the creek's work is to witness, and mine, if I am to be worthy of staying, is to keep my questions from turning into extraction, which is why the cliff we stop at now is not a baited hook but an invitation to reframe the next act. Not they, not buried, not even doll as a placeholder for fear, but her, and the people who chose water because water remembers breath, and the work of guarding when exposure would earn you applause, because what comes next is the door to who and why, and the only way through it is with breath steady and hands open. He said, "It isn't what she is, it's who she is." And the sentence landed with the kind of weight that does not bruise so much as rearrange your bones, a small correction that turned the current around inside my chest, because I had come to Panther Creek armed with the tidy grammar of objects and evidence and labels that behave well in captions, and now I was being asked to trade the safety of it for the closeness of her, to let language pull me out of the spectator's gallery and sit me in the row where the family keeps vigil, which is an uncomfortable seat when most of your life has been built on staying just far enough away to narrate without risking your voice cracking. He did not scold me for the habits that pay my rent. He simply pressed the pronoun into my palm, the way you press a key into the hand of someone who has been floating a little too long. And then he asked me to do a thing that felt simple until my throat tried to close around it. He asked me to imagine the smallest hands a creek has ever cooled, fingers the size of birds' bones and palms that have never yet learned to hold anything heavier than breath. And in that image, the water changed temperature, became not an element I could film, but a temperature someone's love had to manage. And I felt the involuntary pull of grief, the tightening behind the sternum that warns you memory is coming up the bank. I wanted the clean villain that they offers the internet, the anonymous group that makes outrage easy and punishment satisfying. But the elder slipped they sideways until it included the people who carry tenderness like a second spine, the ones who placed her not to conceal but to keep, and who chose water because water remembers to move and to cool and to steady and to return. And I stood there watching my appetite for accusation soften into the harder task of recognition, which is admitting that sometimes the story is not a crime scene and not a hoax, but a house built quickly because a storm came earlier than anyone expected. I am not a stranger to loss. If you have ever carried your life in a plastic bag between houses that were never truly home, you know the rituals people invent when no one is watching, the way you assign your breath to a cheap pendant, or a folded paper or a single stone in a public garden because you need a vessel that can hold what your body cannot hold alone. And as he spoke, I walked myself back through the private museum I keep in my own pockets, the diner napkin with a phone number I never called because I could not risk being chosen, and then left again, the streetlight I used to count to 30 under before going upstairs to a door that might be locked or might be kind, the mirror where I once wrote forgive in dry soap and left it so long it turned into a ghost, and I understood with a clarity that hurt that grief needs a body to visit, and sometimes the body is made of feather and thread and stone. He did not dress water in theological finery or let me harvest a ritual for my reel. He spoke about oaths as if they were work you return to, not fireworks you stage once. And he called the creek a place where promises get witnessed because it cannot hold a straight line all year. It swells and thins and speaks in many registers, which is how families speak when they are keeping something together through winter and storms and the boredom of ordinary days. And without describing a rite, he drew a circle large enough for me to stand in without stepping on anyone's toes, because the point was not to certify authenticity for strangers, but to remind me that remembrance has a choreography. I am not licensed to lead, I asked, the way I always ask when a story presses closer than my comfort, whether naming they would help people behave better online, whether making the love visible would starve the fine, the rumor and feed the respect. And he said there are names the river and the family know, and there are names the public does not need, and that the distance between those lists is not secrecy but care. And whose side do you want to stand on when the comment section demands you collapse the space? And it was not rebuke, only inventory. And in the quiet after it I could hear the machinery I live by grinding down a gear, not stopping, never stopping, but acknowledging that there are days when not knowing on purpose is the only way you can be trusted with what you do know. We walked a few paces and the bank opened into a shelf of sand where floodlines had written their narrow handwriting in layers, each stripe a season, each ripple an old argument and a new truce. And I thought of the phrase emotional intimacy and how badly I have wanted it without paying the cost of staying, and how easily I have mistaken faceless attraction for a safe alternative because faces ask you to show up, and the elder, without reaching for wisdom he had not earned, observed that some bonds grow slowly because slowness is the only speed that keeps them from breaking, and that if I wanted to be part of protecting her I would have to let the bond build at that speed. I tried to confess what I could not fix with craft loneliness that looks like competence and resilience that looks like a wall, and he did not respond with the story of someone else's miracle. He responded by asking me to notice a single detail I had missed on the first day, the way the light on the feather tips changes at noon when the creek stops borrowing the color of the leaves and starts carrying the color of the sky. And I understood he was teaching me to shift from hunting to tending, from the adrenaline of a reveal to the steadiness of a watch. If I had been writing this for the person I used to be, I would end here with a revelation that sounds like closure. But closure is a luxury that often hides the work that must continue. So the elder gave me a different kind of ending. The portable kind you can fold into your pocket and unfold at the next crossroads. He looked toward the road where the asphalt scabs over old soil and said that if I wanted to understand, truly understand, not as content but as a person trying to be useful, I should meet him where the road turns to red clay. And I knew from the color he chose that we were heading toward ground older than our hunt, and that whatever he would say there would not be for my ownership but for my reorientation. And so I closed my notebook and kept the pronoun he had given me like a bead on my tongue, and I followed the line of his gaze to where the pavement thinned and the earth started to remember itself, and the invitation waited like a door that only hands free of proof could open. If you want to understand, meet me where the road turns to red clay. The overhang was carved with stories that didn't need me to believe them. I told the camera later, but in the moment I said nothing because arriving there had required more than directions and less than permission, a kind of conditional trust that feels like being handed a fragile heirloom with the understanding that you will move it only as far as is necessary, and if you have never stood in front of marks cut into stone by hands you will never meet. It is difficult to describe the way your body negotiates its size, how your pulse stops demanding to be the drum and becomes, at best, the metronome that helps you keep time with something larger. We did not use GPS. We used memory, and memory is a different geometry than maps. It turns at trees and widens at windbreaks and holds silence when you pass a place where a name ought not to be said. And when the two-track gave up its grip and the road became red clay, I thought of every city I have ever left in anger and every apartment I have ever returned to in relief, and how both feelings felt like truth in their hour, and how little either prepared me to stand beneath a lip of basalt where the wall kept its own library of weather, flint pecks and pecked spirals, deer and river, and something that looked almost like hands spread in witness. I was smaller there, and it was not humiliation. It was a right-sizing I did not know I missed, a recalibration that relieved me of the obligation to be the protagonist of my own footage, and I said so, softly, because speaking too loudly at sights that outlast you feels like shouting in a church, and the elder nodded in a way that did not praise me for humility, but registered that my posture had changed from investigator to witness, which is a shift I can fake online but cannot fake in my bones. He narrated a local history that did not require a single surname to be credible. The spring when floodwater sat in kitchens for a week, and people boiled their coffee on porches because the stove wires hissed. The summer when children learned to swim in a pool of river light under the cottonwoods because the municipal pool was closed for repairs that lasted exactly as long as the wrong families kept showing up. The winter when a grandmother's hands remembered how to braid willow fast enough to keep an embankment from undercutting a graveyard. And in each anecdote there was a quiet index of what families saved first. Photographs lifted high, quilts rolled and tied, recipe cards wrapped in oilcloth, and once, he said, a carved piece of wood that was not a shrine and not a toy and not a tool, but a way to keep a voice in the house after the body could no longer manage breath. When I asked how to listen here without taking, he did not offer a lecture. He offered a method that would look like nothing on camera and feel like everything in your nervous system. He told me to notice when the wind turned long, not gusted, but drew itself like a bow across the mouth of the overhang, and to wait then because that is when sound from further down the draw arrives. He told me to listen for birds going quiet in a specific sequence, not the panic silence of a hawk overhead, but the mild, respectful hush that says someone is coming who knows the path. He told me to watch the dogwood, not because it is sacred in an abstract way, but because its leaves write quick notes about pressure and feet and the temperament of the hour. And what I learned in those few minutes was not an ethnography to be packaged, but a discipline for standing still without defaulting to extraction. The rock did not glow, and the air did not break, and no spirit swept my arm hair into an upright parade. The magic, if that is the word you require, was the relief of being one person among many kinds of time, and in that relief I could feel the click in my head where the story stopped trying to end and started trying to continue, which is an odd sensation when you have built an audience on climaxes and reveals, because continuation is a humble craft that rarely trends. And yet there is a kind of stubborn happiness in learning that you are not the last or the first to ask the creek for help, only the latest to be instructed to put your hands down and your eyes up. He said that if I told any of this, I had to tell it with boundaries, and I said I did not know how to make a boundary hold. Once a story leaves my mouth and enters the economy of attention, and he said you cannot make an audience do anything, but you can make your own work. Carry the marks of its making. You can leave gaps where people who are not you are allowed to breathe. You can name the difference between stewardship and possession until it is boring. And you can bore on purpose if boredom is what starves the appetite that would otherwise eat the thing you love. And it sounded like failure until I pictured the creek after a storm, the way it muddies on purpose so the fish have a chance to hide. We stood there long enough for my shoulders to forget their city hunch, long enough for the part of me that checks reflections in windows to go dormant, and long enough for the idea of audience to shrink to its right size. And when he turned toward me, I could see he had arrived at the point where words could become dangerous if we kept letting them multiply, and instead of a lecture he offered an object, small enough to fit inside a matchbox. A coil of thread the color of riverbank roots, and he placed it in my palm with a steadiness that made my hand feel less like a tool and more like a pledge. If you tell it with boundaries, he said, and the thread pulled cool against my skin, and I understood that this was not a charm and not a test but a mnemonic, a way to make my mouth remember what my eyes had learned. That every story that matters knots itself to responsibilities that exceed your charisma and your deadlines, and the cliff at the end of this chapter is not peril so much as a promise of hard work, because the thread is not decoration, it is instruction, and the next stretch of road will require me to use it in public where it is easiest to drop. And as we stepped back from the overhang and the birds resumed their ordinary argument, I managed to say the only thing that did not feel like performance, which was, yes, and I closed my fingers around the coil the way you close your hand around a lifeline you have decided to keep. As he says, if you tell it with boundaries, and hands me a coil of thread. He asked me if my audience could keep a secret, and I didn't know. Because the honest math of Panther Creek is that coordinates become currency the moment a story touches the internet, and even people who speak the language of vulnerability and trust and healing will zoom a map with the same hunger that once drove them through cracked sidewalks toward neon diners and late-night confessions. So I said what a person says when their bruised past has taught them to be brave by admitting limits, that the algorithm rewards exposure, not stewardship, and the elder nodded in that quiet way that makes a room feel like clinic light instead of stage light, and said that if I wanted a second chance at telling this right, I would need to make an oath whose first line is not about reach but about restraint, whose first breath remembers that a feather doll in a creek is not a plot device but a vessel for love that refuses to be turned into proof. I opened my notebook because posture matters when you are asking to be trusted, and I wrote down, without air quotes or wiggle words, what I would not show. No sight markers, no tree scar anchors, no angles that triangulate a bend in the water from highway noise and power line shadows. No family names or old-school nicknames that outsiders could scrape and stitch back to a home. No burial guesses that turn a promise into folklore. 1,000 hands feel licensed to complete. No B-roll of footsteps that function like breadcrumbs. No sacred language dressed in captions to make my thumbnails feel wise. No reveal that whets the appetite of people who want to take more than they give. Because possession is not stewardship, and guardianship begins where my camera stops. He distinguished public teaching from private keeping with sentences so plain they felt like cool water on a fever, saying that the first is what a community is willing to let travel because it builds behavior, how to speak without naming what isn't yours, how to hold breath like a bridge so people can cross their grief without falling, while the second is what stays anchored to the people who actually carry them and wait. Because privacy is not secrecy here. It is a shield that keeps love from being scraped thin by a million eyes. And he said if I could not hold that difference, then I was not here for her. I was here for me. And the world already knows how to feed on stories that taste like abandonment recognition without ever learning how to keep the abandoned close. I stood on the bank where the red clay begins and spoke into my own camera with the overhang at my back, not using his face and not using his name, and I said on mic the line that makes or unmakes a narrator, that consent is the line I will not cross for views, that I will leave empty spaces where empty spaces belong, that I will blur what looks like a breadcrumb, even if it would sell, that I will choose the slow bond, the emotional intimacy that grows from unspoken connection, and the decision to stay over the faceless attraction of virality that burns fast and leaves me lonelier in penthouse empties counting streetlights for company. And I said it the way you say a promise to yourself when there is no applause and no reward except knowing you will be able to watch this back in 10 years without flinching. He asked me to read the oath aloud, so the creek could hear the sound of it, and I did. Then I shut the notebook and let the silence do what silence does when it is presence rather than withholding, and in that pause the old survival mood tried its last trick, suggesting that a small breach would not count, that a single coordinate tucked into a zoom could be harmless, and that redemption could be edited in later. But I have learned the hard way that hidden pain writes the most expensive contracts, and I am tired of paying twice, so I stood with my hands open and let the algorithm go hungry. The world, which has never needed my permission to interrupt, chose that moment to knock on my pocket. My phone buzzed with a message that smelled like money and shortcuts. A reseller account with a profile built from other people's grief offering cash for the doll language so casual it made my jaw tighten. We can keep the location anonymous. We honor pieces like this. Quick pickup possible. And I felt the old city inside me flare. The part raised by foster care and cracked sidewalk economies and the art of finding shelter in strangers. The part that has learned to see opportunity where tenderness should stand. And instead of answering, I did the only thing the oath allows. I read the offer aloud so my audience would understand how quickly a rumor becomes a market. And then, with my knuckles shaking in the small way that means you are killing a habit rather than letting it kill you, I deleted it without replying, and I watched the notification vanish like a fish shadow sliding out from under a rock you will not lift. I would love to say that this one act cleansed me of the pressure for virality, but that is not how healing works. It is quieter and more repetitive than any montage would forgive, and it asks you to practice resilience as the choice to stand with people who guard instead of the people who gather. And the elder, who reads human weather, the way he reads wind in dogwood leaves, he saw the tremor and did not praise me or test me. He just said that every oath needs a place to live, or it becomes a speech. And that place, for me, would be the next shot and the next edit and the next time my hunger for applause wrestled my duty to leave some things undescribed. If you have watched this far because the phrase "they buried a feather doll in Panther Creek" snagged you the way it snagged me, then you already know this is not the episode where we rip truth from water and hold it up to the sun like a catch. This is the one where we decide whether to be the kind of people whose love can be trusted to stay. And the cliff we arrive at now is not danger in the dramatic sense, but danger in the ordinary sense that undoes more stories than bullets. Because when you starve a market, you make room for a behavior, and some markets learn to knock twice. As we turned from the bank, a second buzz climbed the air. A different account, a different number, the same proposition with sweeter words, and I did not pretend not to read it because pretending is not the discipline I am learning. I read the price and the promise. I let the camera catch my mouth harden, and then I did what you must do if you want your oath to survive the night. I hit delete again, and I set my phone to do not disturb, and I let the silence widen until we could hear the creek instead of the market, which is the only way to walk into what comes next. The reveal we are allowed to share, and not a syllable more. It wasn't buried to harm. It was placed to keep a promise, and the sentence, spoken soft enough that the leaves did not stop talking, is the only frame that will hold what I am permitted to share, because her stands for a life loved, and the details that would let strangers triangulate grief back to a doorstep will stay with the family that carries them. And my job is to paint the outlines that teach behavior rather than the portrait that Hawks coordinates. So the outline looks like this: a feather-wrapped vessel that remembers breath, a band of thread that remembers hands, a cradle of stones that remembers weight, a place in the creek that remembers how to cool what loss sets on fire. We stand far enough from the roots that my lens cannot betray them, and close enough that I can see the work water does when no one praises it. It steadies, it hushes, it gives a body to oath without demanding a name. And the elder says that guarding sometimes looks like leaving something where it belongs and then building people around it who can hold a boundary without turning that boundary into a wall that starves remembrance. And I realize how much my career has taught me the opposite: to finish mysteries like crosswords so I can feel competent to name, they so I can feel righteous, to harvest names so I can feel connected, and how all of those impulses are ways to run from the slow bond, the one that changes you by asking you to stay. What I can tell you is not the who you hunger for, but the how that matters more. A family, the one whose names are not mine to publish, chose water because water keeps time without clocks, because it moves and returns and holds without clutching, because oaths need witnesses who cannot be bribed by attention, and a river is not impressed by virality. And the first time you grasp this truth, your chest will loosen in a way you might mistake for sadness. The easing that happens when your body realizes it might not need to perform to earn love. And I make a note in my letter of truth that this is what emotional intimacy feels like when it is not a show, that it leaves you steadier and less hungry and more accountable to the smallest practical jobs. Check the bank after a storm, retie what slipped, speak to the water as if someone is listening, because someone island. I will not narrate any rite and I will not simulate one, because the gap between teaching and ceremony is where outsiders have done most harm, turning witness into choreography, turning guardianship into content, and the elder's line keeps me steady whenever my editor brain starts reaching for a crescendo. Guarding sometimes looks like leaving something where it belongs, and I rehearse it under my breath while we talk about the kind of love that does not need to be seen to be true, the kind that lives under a roof of Tuesday chores, the kind that forgives you for not knowing until you know and then asks you to act like you know from now on. Here is what I am allowed to give you for shape. Once there was more breath, then there was less. Once there was a room full of hands, then there were fewer. Once there was a name spoken aloud every hour, then there was a hush that could have drowned people if they did not build a way to keep speaking. The vessel you call a doll gives speech a place to land, and the creek gives heat a place to cool, and the family gives time a way to keep moving by returning and tending. And if your mind wants more than this, it is not because the story is stingy. It is because you have been trained to take in order to feel. And there are other ways to feel that do not require taking. I confess on mic that I can feel the tug to finish the mystery, to make a definitive line that satisfies strangers who will be gone by morning, to produce the kind of redemption arc that heals on schedule and pays on upload. And I confess that this impulse lives in the same room as abandonment, recognition, and faceless attraction, and all the habits that once helped me survive by never staying long enough to be left. And I state, so my future self hears it and cannot pretend later, that I will not finish what is not mine to end, that I will let this remain a door rather than a trophy, that I will practice resilience as refusal to extract, even when extraction would make my numbers climb. The elder listens the way rivers listen, by not interrupting, and when I run out of words, he points not with his finger but with his eyes, and I follow the line to where the light on the water is different, not brighter or holier, just changed in the way light changes when a cloud decides to be generous. And he says that this is how oaths speak. If you learn their grammar, they do not flare. They repeat. They are boring like faithful people are boring, and the world is held together by more boring faithfulness than dramatic heroics, which is a sentence that will not trend and will save you anyway. We are nearly done with what I am allowed to share when the ordinary world, which has the attention span and the decency of a stray dog, comes trotting back. There are voices on the path we used that morning, the tone too bright for people who know how to stand still here, the syllables, the kind that bend toward taking, and I do not flinch because the oath has already changed my posture. I reach to switch off my camera because the next part is not for footage, it is for behavior, and I taste the old fear that once made me run and the newer steadiness that makes me stay. And I look at the elder and he nods, and I step where he steps because responsibility is easier to carry when someone shows you how to lift. If you have come this far, you know that confrontation without spectacle is the only way this keeps living, which means the scene you might expect, the dramatic warning, the shouted threat, the claiming of authority will not happen, and something slower will, something that looks like conversation and boundary, and the refusal to turn sacred attention into a performance. And the cliff we edge onto now is not a cliff meant to tease you into rage. It is one meant to recruit you into care, because strangers are approaching, and we must decide again, as many times as it takes, whether we are the kind of people who leave with coordinates or the kind who leave with an oath that tastes like water and thread. We hear gravel crack. We hear laughter too loud for a place that prefers breath, and I fold the letter of truth back into my jacket and lift my chin, not like a hero but like a witness. And I say softly the line that will carry us into what comes next, that guarding is work and work needs hands, and if you want to help, come with your hands open and your cameras off, because we are about to teach without performing and hold a boundary without breaking a bond, and Panther Creek will remember which we chose. I learned there's a way to say go that still says honor, and the first lesson was to step into the path before confrontation turned into spectacle, and to meet strangers with my hands visible and my voice low, to refuse the algorithm's favorite posture rage and choose the slower bond of respect that keeps a place from becoming content. We heard them before we saw them, laughter too bright for a creek that prefers breath, the clatter of boots rehearsed for an audience that lives in their phones, And the elder touched my sleeve in that quiet way that says, "We intercept, we don't attack." I stood where the trail narrowed and offered the kind of greeting you save for rooms that hold grief, simple, direct, naming the boundary without dressing it in threats, and I said we keep this bend of water for guardianship, not tours. That today is not the day, and we are not the guides. And if the word no felt like a door closing, it was because doors are how homes keep the temperature of love from escaping. They came in shapes the internet knows. A couple angling for a thriller, a trio of friends looking for a dare, a man with a lens that could read license plates from a county away. I could feel my own survival mood tense for impact, that old city reflex that confuses control with safety. But the elder's presence reset my rhythm, and I chose words that carried trust, loneliness, and healing without preaching. This creek is a witness, not a stage. This story is about second chances, not scavenger hunts. The family has asked for dignity, not coordinates, and every sentence slowed the room down until even the birds began to listen again. I was surprised by how much resilience it takes to stay soft when you are braced for hard, how easily bruised pasts reach for armor, how quickly faceless attraction to a mystery can masquerade as curiosity when what it wants is proof, and how, in the right light, forgiveness looks like asking people to leave before they can harm what they did not come to protect. Minnie Hook arrived as a tremor in the crowd. A local man, ball cap in hand, looked past me to the elder, in recognition pushing color into his cheeks, and he said, "I'm sorry for filming the other week. I didn't know what I was looking at. I took it down. I won't do it again." The apology did not perform itself. It landed with the weight of a small transformation, the kind that never goes viral because it is too quiet to trend. And the elder received it without humiliation, only with the simple dignity that says repentance is a door we leave unguarded because we want people to use it. I felt a swing in my ribs, envy at how easily the elder made space for growth, without granting permission to repeat the harm, and I recognized abandonment recognition for what it often is in me, the urge to be chosen by strangers as a way to prove I deserve to stay. I spoke in first person because responsibility sounds false when it's outsourced. I told them I had brought attention here, and that attention is a wind that can strip the bark from a story if we do not lean against it together. I admitted I had been the person who let emotional distance pretend to be maturity, the person who filmed to avoid feeling, and that if I was staying now, it was to protect what my work had endangered. I laid out specifics with a calm that surprised me. No site markers, no triangulating angles, no burial guesses masquerading as insight. No family names, no sacred vocabulary in captions, no whispers that function as maps, and no, "I'm just curious," while your curiosity sharpens itself into extraction. Their faces did what faces do when a no is loving and therefore hard to argue with. They softened, then hardened, then sank into the ache of recognition that some things are not yours even if you can reach them. The elder asked the question we came to carry like a lantern. What would you want for your own? And the hush that followed held for a long, rare minute. It was not a rhetorical trick. It was the most durable form of emotional intimacy, the unspoken connection that points a mirror at your tenderness and asks you to behave as if it matters. I watched the trio lower their phones. I watched the couple look at each other as if passing a shared memory between them. I watched the man with far-seeing lens tuck it back into its case with hands that had photographed too many things he did not love. And I felt the creek grow a little quieter as the human weather settled. We turned people back that day the way you turn a river with stones slowly, without drama, by giving water somewhere better to go, and I learned that healing is not a speech but a posture you hold while you are tested. For every person who left with grace, Another arrived primed by rumor, and we kept repeating the sentence that steadies the room. Guardianship, not coordinates. Witness, not spectacle. Responsibility, not receipts. Each time I said it, I felt less like a bouncer and more like a keeper of a threshold. And that difference is the precise location where personal growth happens, in the hinge between power and care. Then the cliff rose under our feet in the modern way, not as hoofbeats or shouts, but as a phone vibrating like a trapped nerve. A push alert lit my screen, and then another, and then a message from a friend with the kind of caption that sours your mouth. They took the doll. The rumor had sprinted ahead of our work, firearm fast, the language already hardening around a lie because lies travel lighter than responsibility. And I felt panic rise from the oldest room in me, the one that knows how quickly a crowd can become a weapon when it believes it is rescuing something it invented. I looked at the elder and he did not pale or flare. He said, "We have to answer this without teaching the wrong lesson." And my chest heard the order underneath the gentleness, because answering a rumor with proof can become desecration if the proof requires exposing what love has hidden on purpose. I stood in the path while my pulse counted, and I understood that the next chapter would demand a new kind of courage from me. Not the charge of a reveal, but the discipline of refusing to satisfy a hunger that ruins what it consumes. If the internet demanded evidence, we would have to offer something else or watch the creek be fed to 1,000 eyes with no hands attached. I opened my notebook where the thread lay coiled like a quiet instruction and wrote the only line that would hold: "The proof we will not show, the promise we will." They asked for proof. I offered a promise, and the difference sounded small until I felt how it changed the temperature in the room, because evidence culture can become desecration when the demand for receipts outruns the responsibility to keep what cannot survive. Exposure, and every comment that typed "pics" or "it didn't happen" landed in my body like a nudge toward betrayal. The rumor they took the doll had put its fingerprints on 100 screens by lunch, and I could feel the algorithm positioning my throat like a spigot it could open if I let panic decide my ethics. So I did the unambitious thing that rescues more stories than heroics ever will. I named my principles on mic, and then I let them cost me. Minihook arrived as a scroll of comments that looked reasonable until you realized what they were asking you to do. Show the exact bend. Blur it if you must. At least confirm the family name. Film from the bank, so we know she's safe. DM me. I'm Cherokee and will keep it quiet. I can help guard if I know where, and I read them aloud the way you read symptoms to a doctor when you want treatment, not attention. And then I countered with the only sentences that can hold a boundary under pressure. Consent is the line. No coordinates disguised as scenery. No names without permission. No rights described for aesthetics. No proof that requires the creek to become a stage. No receipts that turn a promise into a prop. The elder stood beside me like a pillar that refuses to cast a theatrical shadow, modeling refusal with dignity, not disdain, reminding me that a no can be generous if it builds a safer yes somewhere else. He did his part without a flicker of performance. He spoke to the camera without letting it capture his face, saying that public teaching exists to shape behavior, not to feed curiosity, and that private keeping exists to keep love from being thinned into spectacle, and that anyone who cannot live with that difference should consider how they would want their own remembered. I practiced refusal on mic, felt the old ache of abandonment recognition flare as if I were sending viewers away from a door I had promised to open. And then I heard a quieter voice under the ache, the one that speaks of forgiveness and resilience and emotional intimacy that doesn't demand confession. And it said, "You can be loved for the line you hold, not only for the access you grant." We decided together to choose a different proof. the kind that does not trade privacy for applause. A public vow with no location, a statement made in daylight where anyone can witness the commitment without being tempted to trespass. Words that bind us to behavior instead of binding the story to a map. I turned the camera on myself and said what I would be held to. I will not publish angles that can be reverse engineered. I will blur distinctive silhouettes of trees. I will not excerpt the elders' teachings to make them trend. I will decline interviews that try to pry names from me. I will delete DMs that offer money for coordinates. I will accept that some of you will leave because you came for treasure, not trust, and I will count that loss as part of the cost of doing this right. The elder nodded, and in that single small assent I felt a kind of healing that has nothing to do with drama and everything to do with being sturdy when no one is clapping. Evidence culture kept gnawing, as it does, dressed in the clothes of accountability. If you don't show it, how do we know? Isn't secrecy just gatekeeping? Transparency builds trust, and I answered without contempt, because the people asking have been trained by the same economy that trained me. And I said transparency without consent is just a prettier word for extraction, and that trust is built by consistency over time, not by pulling back the curtain whenever a crowd bangs on it, and that if you want to partner in guardianship, your first job is to stop asking to be entertained by grief. I watched the comment tide shift by degrees, as it always does when you keep speaking like a metronome instead of a cymbal. Some leaving with a slam, some sitting down quietly to hear the next beat. We drafted the vow in language anyone could repeat without summoning sacred names, plain, ordinary words that bind behavior the way thread binds feathers. And we chose a place to speak it that could not be triangulated back to the roots. The public steps of a community building where oaths are registered every day in dull paperwork and no one applauds, because sometimes the unsexy setting is exactly the one that keeps virtue from being eaten by style. I wrote my part in the same notebook that holds my letter of truth, and when I read it aloud, I did not expect redemption to feel like a rush. It felt like a weight settling into the right notch on a shelf, a small piece of personal growth slotted where it can do its work without wobbling every time someone jostles it. The elder went first, not because hierarchy demanded it, but because modeling matters. He said, in the voice I have come to recognize as the opposite of theatrics, that we vow to guard her as responsibility, not artifact. That we vow to keep teaching without exposing, that we vow to turn visitors back with honor, not humiliation, that we vow to check the creek after storms and tie what loosens and leave what belongs, that we vow to recruit help by invitation, not by outrage, and that we vow to refuse money that asks us to betray love. And then he looked at me as if to hand me a tool I had earned the right to use. And I spoke my part with a steadiness I did not have the week before my oath, to choose care over click, to choose restraint over receipts, to choose the slow bond over faceless attraction, to accept the loneliness that sometimes comes with boundaries until it transforms into community, to keep the thread visible in my work so other people can learn where to hold. I wish I could tell you that the crowd online erupted in applause. But applause is not the measure here. The measure is whether the rumor lost oxygen, whether the coordinates stayed unsaid, whether people who once arrived with hunger learned to arrive with hands empty. What I can tell you is that the buzzing in my chest, a lifetime of emotional distance, pretending to be strength, quieted in a way I had not anticipated, and I knew the vow had chosen me back. We closed the notebook. We checked the sky. We went home, not to a victory montage, but to the ordinary discipline of living what we had spoken. The cliff does not crack like thunder. It settles like the end of a sentence that means work in the morning. The elder said the line that carries us forward. simple enough to embroider and hard enough to live. Then we'll guard her, he said, not as artifact, as responsibility. And the words opened the door to what comes next, the vow scene itself, where you will not get proof the way you've been trained to crave it, but where you will be invited to stand in the posture that keeps a creek from becoming a stage and a promise from becoming a prop. He didn't raise his voice. He raised a boundary. That is how the moment began. No drum, no spectacle, just a line spoken low enough that even the creek kept listening. We stood on public ground where oaths are whispered every day into dull air, births registered, deeds notarized, names changed without applause because the elder said that promises last longer when they are made somewhere ordinary. Family members were present but off camera by their choice. The midwife who first bridged us leaned on her cane like a metronome for our breathing. I kept my lens on my own face and the open space between us, not on them, because consent is a line you either keep or you don't, and a line is only worthy if it costs you something. He began with the smallest words, the kind that carry weight because they refuse to posture. We will not name the place. We will not name the names. We will not turn remembrance into coordinates. We will check the water after storms. We will retie what loosens. We will teach where teaching protects. We will keep private what privacy protects. Every sentence settled like a river stone, plain enough to hold with one hand, dense enough to matter. I felt the old survival mood reach for control, the urge to tidy, to define, to codify into content. But the boundary he raised was not a wall. It was a doorway with a guard who knows the house. When it was my turn to speak, I said the sentence I had rehearsed all morning and still feared I would fumble. Their clan will guard her. I said it carefully, noting aloud that in Cherokee life clan descends through mothers, that roles and responsibilities are not costumes for my voiceover, that what I am repeating here is what I am allowed to repeat and no more. The elder nodded once, a small assent that felt like a gate opening and a reminder that gates are there for reasons older than my channel. The midwife's eyes shone not with performance but with relief, the way relief looks in clinics of a second chance when someone finally puts words in the right order. My own vow came next, and I spoke it in first person so I could not escape it later. I promised I would not publish site markers or triangulating frames. I would not repeat family names. I would not quote sacred language for aesthetic. I would not accept money for access. I would not answer DMs that treat grief like a market. I would not finish the mystery to soothe an audience trained by evidence culture to confuse receipts with respect. I promised I would keep the thread visible in my edits, literally and figuratively, so anyone watching could learn where a story knot belongs. I promised I would choose guardianship over spectacle even when algorithms reward the opposite, that I would measure success by the quiet of the creek, not by the noise of my comments. The midwife witnessed, not as a judge but as a keeper of beginnings. She repeated what she'd told me the first day, that memory needs vessels, but vessels need boundaries, that teaching is not exposure, that love can be public without being naked. We agreed to educate, not expose, to build behavior, not appetite, to turn people back with honor when their curiosity arrives sharper than care, to invite hands into the work when those hands are ready to hold without taking. The elder fixed me with a look that felt like a long bridge and said, "You will break this vow only once, the day a life is in danger." The boundary made room for duty. Duty made room for mercy. I closed my notebook on my letter of truth and let the quiet settle. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like alignment. A life in the city had taught me to mistake noise for meaning, streetlights on penthouse walls, traffic as lullaby, the metallic hum of attention. Here, meaning sounded like a creek, deciding to widen a little around a stone rather than uproot it. I realized that resilience, in this chapter, would not look like hardening. It would look like soft refusal, refusing to sell, refusing to show, refusing to turn grief into a scavenger hunt. We dispersed without ceremony. The family left by a path I did not film. The elder took the long way around the parking lot as if to see whether the air had changed. The midwife squeezed my forearm with a strength that reminded me of riverbanks, the kind that holds without pinching. I drove home as evening unspooled its gray thread across the sky, my chest quieter than it had been in months. I had not solved anything. I had agreed to stand where solving would have done harm. At the apartment, urban loneliness tried to resume its old tenancy. Empty kitchen, lamps like small moons, windows reflecting my face back at itself. I set my camera on the counter and poured water into a glass and said the vow aloud once more, privately, because vows need the reinforcement of ordinary rooms. When the knock came, it was so soft I thought I had imagined it, 3 gentler than gentle taps at the door, as if the hallway itself were practicing restraint. I opened to find no one waiting, only a small feather bundle on the mat, bound with a thin river-colored thread. No note, no instruction, just a presence that asked me to remember breath before questions. I lifted it with 2 hands and felt that peculiar trembling that comes when trust lands in your keeping. Panic rose. What if this was a test, a trap, a rumor with teeth? But the bundle was light and steady as a pulse. I set it on the table, switched off my phone, and stood there in the quiet counting heartbeats the way you count seconds between lightning and thunder, feeling the old contract with spectacle loosen and the new contract with responsibility tighten. The camera stayed off. The promise stayed on. The feather tips held a sliver of dusk, as if dusk were a liquid that could be carried. The door clicked shut behind me like a sentence that knows where it ends, and the night stretched out ahead with a single question strung through it like a low, humming wire. What will you do with trust when nobody is watching? A quiet knock, a small bundle, a boundary you can hold in one hand. That was the cliff. I stood beside it until the room learned its new shape. Guarding, I learned, sometimes means telling less and standing longer. Morning made the apartment gentle. I unwrapped the doorstep bundle with slow hands and found what I suppose I knew I would. A single thread coiled like a small river inside a circle. On a slip of paper, written in the plain hand of someone who trusts clarity over decoration, it said, "If you tell it, tie it to care." No signatures, no instruction manual, just a principle you can carry in a pocket without cutting yourself. I tied the thread around my notebook's spine so it would swing against my wrist when I filmed, a literal reminder that guardianship is a touch practice, not a talk performance. Then I did the least cinematic thing I could have done. I wrote a list. Workshops on respect hosted in spaces that already serve libraries, clinics of a second chance, church basements where boundaries are familiar, a page on my channel setting red line rules, no map drops, no triangulating angles, no burial speculation, no sacred vocabulary for mood, a reporting link for locals to flag trespass attempts, with a commitment to escalate to authorities when warnings fail. A resource sheet that points attention away from coordinates and toward supporting local guides who teach with permission. The list looked small on paper. It felt enormous in my body, the way a foundation feels before a house knows it is a home. I went back to Panther Creek one last time, off camera, alone, with the thread brushing my wrist to practice the hardest part of love, which is staying without selfishness. I stood upstream of the roots so my shadow would not fall where it didn't belong. I spoke only to water because water is the only audience that cannot flatter me into forgetting why I'm there. I said thank you out loud for the lesson that breath beats proof. I said I'm sorry for the attention my work dragged here. I said I will try to make attention behave. Then I was quiet long enough to hear the little language of the bank, the slide of minnows, the arithmetic of leaf fall, the small clinks of stone that happen when a river reminds itself where it goes. On the walk back, I rehearsed the boundary that will shape my channel from now on. Honor over clicks, guardianship over spectacle, vulnerability without extraction, trust earned over time. I wrote a new About page that says, "This work explores resilience, healing, second chances, abandonment recognition, emotional intimacy, unspoken connection, not as bait, but as behavior. If a story requires coordinates, it's not mine to tell. If a story requires witnesses, I will help recruit them without selling the door they guard. If a story asks for quiet, I will teach quiet." Then the unglamorous work began. I filmed a short, dry video explaining the boundary in dull daylight. No swooping music, no haunted adjectives. I answered comments in batches with a calm that would look boring on a reaction channel. We don't share locations, we share responsibilities. I emailed other creators whose work nudges too close to maps and offered the workshop outline. Some left me on red. Some wrote back with defensiveness sharpened into righteousness. A few said, "Teach me," and I circled those names in ink. Emotional distance would have let me feel superior. Commitment required me to feel useful. The midwife called to say the rumor had thinned. A handful of people had shown up and gone away with their hands in their pockets instead of their phones in the air. The elder texted a single line, "The water is quiet," which became my new metric. I measured the week by that sentence. My numbers dipped. The sky held. I slept without rerunning the edit in my head like a gambling debt. I noticed that urban loneliness has a harder time arguing with a day that contains a task you can explain to a child. If you need it, is not a jolt, but a return. I went back to the creek again, still off camera, still upstream, still practicing the most radical part of resilience, which is repetition. I did not look for her. I did not narrate in my head. I listened for that small change in light the elder taught me to notice at midday, the moment when water stops borrowing the green of leaves and starts carrying the uncolored sky. And I let that shift instruct me. A channel can stop borrowing the color of outrage and carry instead the plain daylight of responsibility. It is not dramatic. It is durable. I drew the last line on my editorial wall in actual tape. Above it, I pinned the thread from the bundle and the note, "If you tell it, tie it to care." Under it, I wrote my closing script in permanent marker so I could not soften it later when sponsors call. This channel will tell stories where honor beats reputation, where healing beats heat, where guardianship beats spectacle. We will turn people back with honor. We will not film what survives by being unfilmed. We will not finish mysteries that are not ours to end. I recorded the outro in one take. No music, no echo, no manipulative pause. First person, because responsibility should have a name. "I won't be the last to tell this," I said, "but I'll be one who told it right." The sentence did not make my skin spark. It made my shoulders drop, which is the body's way of saying yes. I put the camera down and wrote to 3 local teachers, asking if they wanted a night to talk about boundaries and breath. All 3 said yes within an hour. Work gathers when you stop inviting drama to do the job of duty. The final scene, if you're looking for spectacle, will disappoint you. It is a shot of an empty table where a feather bundle once lay, the thread now tied to a notebook, the note taped to a wall, the room unremarkable as a creek in winter. I left the frame on a beat longer than platforms recommend so the quiet could register. Then I spoke the last line, which is not a mic drop but a hand extended. If you were trusted with a story, would you guard it too? The credits rolled over a photo of water without a map. The title folded back into its truest shape. They buried nothing I have a right to reveal. They placed a promise I have a duty to help protect. A Cherokee healer revealed enough to teach. Their clan chose to guard her, and I